Okay, we are recording. So welcome back to the second day of, or the second session of our Genesis study, which I project to be probably running for about the next year. So we're going to have a good time. We're going to be very thorough, and I guarantee that you're going to learn a lot. I think especially today, you're going to learn a lot because the material that is going to be presented and that we're going to engage around is stuff that frankly you just don't hear in in the church. You just don't hear many pastors or Bible study teachers talking about this. And it's not that it's radical or crazy or only egghead academics hold it. It's actually the common uh, academic view in seminaries and divinity schools all over the country. This would what I'm going to present today is standard fare for Old Testament studies at Columbia Seminary, at Candler School of Theology at Emory, Princeton Theological Seminary, all the mainline seminaries and divinity schools. This is very normal. This is very average. Uh, but it's not something that you typically hear taught in church. Um, and it's not, and I'll tell you, and not to prop me up or anything, but uh, it's not because pastors don't know about it. It's that they either don't care or they simply don't want to engage their flocks with it for varying reasons. I think that's a pity. I think that's a real shame because it's robbed people in the church for generations of a vastly more valuable and frankly interesting read of the first chapter of Genesis. Uh, so let's get our Bibles out before I start doing any talking about it, about the details. Let us read the said chapter. I'm going to read it all the way through, and then we'll just have some general reflection, and then I want to start sharing with you some of this material that I'm excited about. All right. As you all know, I'm reading from the New Revised Standard, but if you're using another version, that is perfectly okay also. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and a darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with a seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky. So God created the great sea monsters, and every living creature that moves of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth of every kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the earth of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. God said, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. And then we have to finish the pericope because it actually carries over into the first few verses of chapter 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Okay. All right. Well, just right off, just to start off, are there any just specific or broad thoughts, reflections that you have upon reading this text, which is, probably quite familiar to us?
I had one question, Tom.
Yes, sir.
And that is, it's a little strange to me. And of course, how long is a day and what's a day, are all kinds of debates about that. But God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it and made it the Sabbath. Yet the people who wrote this celebrated on the sixth day, don't they? On Saturday, the Sabbath.
Seventh day. No, actually, no, it's right. It's right. Because what we call Sunday would be the first day of the week. And so Saturday, the seventh day, would be the Sabbath day, right?
Okay, so what we denominated
In the
Saturday,
morning.
yeah, okay, what we've denominated as Saturday is the seventh day.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's that's the way it would work. Interesting that, just to bring, now that you brought that up, it's interesting that this entire story leads up to a kind of explanation and etiology, as I talked about last week, an etiology of the Sabbath. That the story of creation would wind up with an explanation of how we got the Sabbath. Interesting. There's a reason for it, by the way, and we'll talk about it later, but it's just curious that a story having to do, that is supposedly about how God created the universe, would end with an etiology of the Sabbath. Why we have the Sabbath. Where did it start? It has its foundations apparently in the creative activity of God. Okay, what else? Any other just general observations or questions or thoughts or?
This is Sandy. I just think it's some of the most beautiful language ever written, Genesis.
It is indeed. It is indeed. It's, I was actually, as I was reading it out loud, it's been a while since I've actually read it out loud to myself. And as I was reading, I was having a very similar thought to what you just expressed, and that is just how this sounds like poetry, how beautiful and majestic the language is, which suggests two things to me. First of all, it suggests what kind of literature this is, okay? What kind of literature the first chapter of Genesis is. And it also suggests something quite transcendent and majestic about its primary subject, that is God. And it's precisely the form of the language that provides the perfect, is both the expression of the kind of literature that it is, but provides the perfect medium to make these grand assertions about God and and the character and nature of God. Yeah, good stuff. Anything else? Okay. Well, Genesis 1 has been interpreted over the centuries, over the millennia, for that matter, in different ways. We're probably most familiar with a more or less straightforward, naturally literal interpretation, which has seen the events of chapter 1, the day of creation, to be literal events that occurred at the very beginning of the earth and the universes. Okay. And that's certainly one way of looking at it. It may be surprising to you that back in the days of the church fathers, back in like the first few centuries of the Christian church, that was not the ordinary way of interpreting Genesis chapter 1. It was much more in vogue, for example, the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, to interpret many scriptures, but Genesis 1 is a good example, symbolically, to interpret it as a poetic metaphor for spiritual and not physical truths. Okay, that is largely forgotten these days. We typically think that we've gotten more attuned to fact and to science and whatnot, over time, and have or alternately, we've been more open in recent days to symbolic interpretations, metaphorical interpretations, and that in the past people were always more naturally literal. But that is broadly true, but in the first few centuries of the Christian church, it was actually quite in vogue to interpret things metaphorically and symbolically. In fact, in many ways, some of these interpretations were quite fanciful, in that they reflected much more the imagination of the interpreter than they did anything that was actually present in the text. It was quite unmoored from the realities of the text. But yeah, natural literalism is kind of what we're most used to. And if you grew up in any kind of generally traditional Protestant church, you may have grown up with the study Bible, the King James Study Bible. What's the name of it? Not Scopes. It's Doesn't matter. Point is that you grew up with you grew up with the teaching that Genesis chapter 1 is a more or less literal, elaborate, more or less a literal presentation of how God created the universe and how God created the universe over 6 days. And before science, before something, yes,
You're saying the universe.
yes.
All right. Where do the other planets come in?
Strictly speaking, in Genesis 1, they don't. I mean,
Not know of them.
strictly speaking, they're not really referred to in at least on a literal level. They're not referred to in the first chapter of Genesis. We get the stars and we get the sun and the moon, which are named specifically. Other planets are not actually specifically named. Again, ancient people, this far, they had no idea what was out there. They had no idea what was out there. All they knew was what they could see with their own eyes. And they could see the sun and the moon, and they could see the stars. It was with the advent of modern science that we began to entertain the idea that there might be issues with a natural, literal interpretation of Genesis 1. Many of you have heard of Archbishop James Ussher. He was an Anglican primate of Ireland in the 17th century, and he famously took literally the book of Genesis, and through a series of very, very, very complicated and elaborate calculations, concluded that the creation of the world, or that day one of creation, this let there be light moment, occurred at 6 p.m. on October the 22nd, 4004 BC. Now we laugh. I mean, we enlightened people, whatever, may laugh about that right now, but people for a long time took that idea very seriously. Not necessarily 4004 BC. We might quibble over, a few hundred years here or there, but the idea that the world was created in what, from our point of view, would be the relatively recent past. Like the world is like 6,000 years old, or maybe just a tad more, or maybe just a tad less. That's been a view that has been widely held by the Christian church for a very, very long time. And it really was only with the advent of modern science that kind of common sense, natural, literal view ever came into question. It first came into question in a big way with the publication of a groundbreaking book in 1831 called The Principles of Geology by Sir Charles Lyell. It was a Scottish geologist. And his idea was that the features that we see on Earth, the mountains and the valleys and all of that, that the geological features of the Earth were not, in fact, the result of a cataclysmic flood that happened like 5,000 years ago, but are, in fact, features that have come to be over millions upon millions of years through uniform processes. What Charles Lyell gave us was the idea of looking at the Earth that we live on as having been the result of millions of years of process. Later on, about 2.5 decades later, Charles Darwin came along with his theory of natural selection, and given a big span of time by Lyell, Darwin was able then to explain how we have such diversity of life on Earth as we do. If you only had 5,000 or 6,000 years for the diversity of life to come about, you wouldn't have nearly enough time. But Lyell gave Darwin a gift, and that is time. He gave Darwin the gift of time, which then gave enough time for the process of natural selection to work in such a way that it could be a definitive theory to explain the diversity of life on Earth. And so either way, so all of this together meant that we're looking scientifically at a world, at a universe that's literally billions of years old. The most recent estimation is about 13.7 billion years old. And that life on Earth has existed for at least about 3 billion years, for about 3 billion years on Earth. And so then naturally the question comes, well, what do you do with Genesis 1? Now, of course, some believers have rejected the science outright. Have just said the science is wrong. Okay, you be my guest. I mean, if you want to do that, that's fine. I don't buy it, but some people believe what they believe. Some Christians have rejected the science outright. Others have sought to reconcile them somehow, to say that, okay, the book of Genesis says the world was created in 6 days. Well, maybe a day is not a day as we understand a day, 24-hour day. Maybe it's a day from some kind of higher divine point of view. So it could be there's that text in either 1st or 2nd Peter in the New Testament where it says that to God a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years as a day. Okay, well now you've got something. Now you've got a way you can say, okay, the days of Genesis are unfathomably long periods of time, and so you could then reconcile evolution and what we understand of geology with still a more or less literal reading of first chapter of Genesis. Now, in my not so humble opinion, that interpretation, as much as I appreciate the attempt to reconcile science and religion, and I do, and I'm very sympathetic to that, I think that the day-age theory is one that frankly misses the point. It's well-intentioned, and it's certainly much more accurate, in my view, than a recent 6,000 years ago the universe came into being. But I think it misses the point because it's still trying to run in the stream of a literal interpretation. And I think it's the literal interpretation itself that actually needs to be abandoned. And so open up a possibility that we're simply no longer reading the first chapter of Genesis for scientific information about how the universe came into being. And that what we're actually looking at is not an early scientific text. We're looking at poetry. And we don't ask poetry to answer scientific questions. Okay? And let me just offer a few things, just to run with a literal interpretation for a second. Isn't it curious that we're even talking about days at all, given that the sun was not created until the 4th day? Isn't it curious? What about the first? How did you define the first 3 days if the sun itself wasn't created until the 4th day, right? That was actually a point that was famously made by Clarence Darrow against William Jennings Bryan in the Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee, back in the 1920s, famously memorialized in that classic movie Inherit the Wind. So, I mean, even just right there in the midst of the text, it's like the text itself is crying out not to be read in a literal way. All right. Well, here's the starting point for how we do read the first chapter of Genesis. And it starts out in a way that troubled many believers for a long time, still troubles some people. But But I think it's a gateway to understanding the true intention, the true purpose of Genesis 1, which is actually quite spiritually remarkable. In 1849, an archaeologist by the name of Austin Henry Layard excavated the ruins of the ancient capital of the Assyrian Empire, Nineveh. Now, you may remember Nineveh from your reading of the book of Jonah in the Bible. That's the city that Jonah was called of God to go and prophesy against. And you know how the story of Jonah goes. He doesn't want to go. He tries to run away. He does run away, but then he gets caught up, gets swallowed up by a great fish, and spends 3 days 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of the whale, and then is spit up on the ground. He eventually does go to Nineveh, declares that God's going to pour down his wrath in judgment, and the Ninevites repent, and God changes his mind about the wrath that he's going to pour out. The Assyrian Empire was really active in the ancient world from about the 900s BC to the really into about the 600s BC, and so their capital was Nineveh, and that was what would be in today in northern Iraq into southern Syria. And Layard, the archaeologist, excavated Nineveh, and he discovered the library of Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal was an emperor of the Assyrian Empire, and he created a grand, not presidential library, a grand imperial library. And Layard excavated it, and he's excavating a library. And so he finds texts, that is, texts that are not on paper, but rather on clay tablets written in cuneiform. Cuneiform is that funny ancient Mesopotamian writing system. And scholars were learning how to read that text, how to read that script. And they discovered that Layard discovered that what he had found in the library of Ashurbanipal were ancient texts, one called the Enuma Elish, and the other was, I don't know the Babylonian name for it, but we know it in English as the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, why do we care about the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh? Well, here's why. First of all, Enuma Elish and the Gilgamesh epic are both older, far older than any text of the Old Testament, any text of the book of Genesis, for instance. They're older. They predate the writing of Genesis 1. Enuma Elish tells the Babylonian creation story. And it is a creation story that sounds in many ways oddly similar to the story that is presented in Genesis 1. There are very important differences, and we'll talk about those. But it was very curious how the events of the Babylonian creation epic, which is older than the Genesis story, that the creation unfolds in a very similar pattern and order as it does in Genesis 1. And And I mean, it's a weird lineup of what's happening in these first phase, second phase, third phase. The same things are emerging. It's really, really odd. The Epic of Gilgamesh is about a great hero, Gilgamesh, the great warrior. But one part of the epic is where he goes to visit the man who survived the Great Flood by building an ark. And he goes to him in search of the secret to everlasting life. Reading the story once again, it's reading Gilgamesh. What you have in these cuneiform texts is the flood story. The flood story and the creation story from the Babylonian civilization predating the book of Genesis. Now, there were a number of responses to this. There were people who were very anti-church, very anti-Christianity at the time, who looked at that and said, the Genesis one is as much a myth as any of those crazy myths of Babylonia in ancient times. And therefore we don't have to take the Bible seriously anymore. We don't have to take Genesis seriously. That was one response. On the other side, there were Christians who were making, in some ways, the opposite case, either denying that the parallels existed, which was frankly just silly, denying that the parallels existed, or arguing against all reason that that the biblical versions were actually older, which they weren't, and archaeology demonstrated that conclusively. Some even, hey Wendy, some even brought up the idea of the mimicry of the devil, that the devil intentionally created false mythical accounts in order to throw off egghead Christians in the future. Okay. I mean, that is seriously, it's like there are people out there who believe that Satan planted fake fossils in the ground so that later on Christians who became scientists and explorers of the past would discover these and be misled to believe Darwin over the Bible. I mean, just crazy stuff that people come up with. So anyway, so those were some of the reactions to what was going on. Now let me tell you about Enuma Elish real quick. Let me tell you kind of about what it says, because knowing this is important for understanding what's going on in Genesis 1. The Enuma Elish was probably first, and it has its roots in very ancient Babylonian sources, comes down in the source that it did in the Library of Ashurbanipal, probably by about 1000 BC. Its purpose, first and foremost, the purpose of the Enuma Elish Babylonian creation story, is to serve as a literary monument to the god of Babylon, Marduk, M-A-R-D-U-K, Marduk. Marduk as the champion of the gods and creator of the heavens and the earth. Its object, the object of the myth, is to offer justification for Marduk's accession from the chief god of just Babylon to being the supreme god of all the gods. Okay, the Enuma Elish was a public liturgy. It was something that the people in the Babylonian Empire recited out loud publicly on the 4th day of the Babylonian New Year's festival. And it was to celebrate the accession of the god of Babylon to being the head of all the gods. Now, that's an interesting, mythic or spiritual belief, but what it does is it provides a theological foundation, an ideological foundation for a political truth, for justifying Babylon's rule over other nations. The reason why Babylon is supreme is because Babylon's God is supreme. All right? That's the key. That's the purpose of the story. It's not the purpose of the Babylonian story is not to tell Babylonians how the world came into being, although they may well have literally believed that it came into being that way in this particular fashion. The purpose of the myth was not to tell them that. It was to justify Babylon's rule over other nations by saying that Babylon's God rules over all the other gods. Babylon's God is the greatest God. Now, understanding this function of the Babylonian story is crucial. It's very important for what we're going to do with Genesis. Let me real quickly summarize the events of the Enuma Elish. This is important. The the gods do not exist at the beginning. What is true at the beginning is that all there is primordial chaos. Okay, that is what is in the beginning, is primordial chaos. And out of the primordial chaos, generations of gods emerge from the primordial ooze. Okay, in fact, 6 generations. It's important. 6 generations of gods emerge out of the primordial goo. The gods then that emerge turn against the primordial chaos, which is symbolized by a great dragon whose name was Tiamat. Okay, a great monster named Tiamat. And the gods that emerge from the chaos then turn on the chaos monster from which they emerged, or at least most of the gods do. But they are unable to defeat Tiamat. Marduk then offers to destroy Tiamat if he is made leader of the gods. Marduk then battles and then defeats Tiamat and rips the monster's corpse in half and fashions the universe, fashions the earth and the skies, creates the calendar. The Babylonians were famous for their calendar. It's from the Babylonian calendar that we get the concept of 24-hour days and 60 minutes to an hour. That's where we get it. It's from the Babylonians. So Marduk creates the calendar. He creates the planets and the stars and the sun and the moon and the weather. The gods who originally sided with Tiamat against Marduk are initially forced into slavery, but are freed when Marduk agrees to create human beings. Why? He creates human beings to be slaves of the gods. And therefore the gods that resisted, that fought with Tiamat were forgiven. They didn't have to be slaves anymore because now human beings have been created as slaves. Okay. So I said that there were 6 generations of gods that emerged from the primordial ooze. It is interesting that what those gods were gods of parallel the 6 days of creation in Genesis. That is to say, if the dry land appears on the 3rd day of the Genesis story, it is in the 3rd generation of emerging from the primordial ooze that the god of the earth emerges. Okay, so you have that parallel. You also have, once Marduk actually starts the creation unfolds in the order of light emanating from the gods, the creation of the firmament, the appearance of the dry land, the creation of the heavenly luminaries, the creation of all life and all human beings, and then the gods resting and celebrating. Okay, that's the order in which it happened on Marduk's side. Okay, now all of this, what is going on with Genesis 1? It's clear that they're parallel. It's clear that the authors of Genesis 1 knew of, they had to have known, they would have known of this ancient Babylonian myth. Now, are they just plagiarizing it because they don't have a myth of their own? No, they're not doing that at all. But they are crafting their poetry in full awareness of that Babylonian story. They know the Babylonian story, but they're appropriating it for their own purposes.
Well, Tom, it was written during the exile, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And that
makes a lot of sense that if it was written during the exile, that they would draw on their captors' mythology.
Exactly. That is critical. But you may have, some of you may have missed this last week, But I said last week, when talking about the different sources of Genesis, and said that one of the sources was a priestly source. And the priestly source is dated to the time of the Babylonian exile, to a time when a group of priests were trying to keep the Jewish community's hopes alive, trying to keep them alive as a community when they were under so much Babylonian imperial pressure to just simply dissolve into the larger Babylonian reality, to cease having a distinctiveness as a people, to just simply assimilate, into the broader Babylonian imperial system. And the priests struggled against that desperately, trying to keep their Jewish identity alive. The creation story of Genesis uses the Babylonian story, is conscious of the Babylonian story, aware that the Babylonian story is used by the Babylonians to prop up the supremacy of Babylon's god, Marduk. The priests take that story, keep its essential structure, but completely subvert it. They completely rewrite it, using the same structure and the same order, but they change all the names and have a different purpose. Let's just consider this. If you have, for example, in the Babylonian version, the gods emerge out of the muck. They don't exist at the beginning. They emerge out of the primordial chaos. In Genesis 1, God, the supreme God, is there at the beginning. God, Israel's God, does not emerge out of anything. Israel's God exists from before the creation. Second of all, Marduk creates, and it creates the universe out of the body of Tiamat. He battles and struggles and fights, and that's how Marduk does create the world. He creates it through battle and strife and struggle. And of course, the Babylonians, loved that. They thought that was a wonderful thing to be able to say about one's God, that our God does all this. The God of Genesis speaks, commands, and it is so. Israel's God doesn't need to fight and struggle and battle. Israel's God speaks, and it is done. Let there be light, and there was light. Let the dry land appear, and the dry land appeared. It is the creation unfolds, all that is unfolds by the decree of God, not because God has to fight or struggle or create the material nature of the universe out of a monster's bloody body. Okay. Israel's God is so transcendent to all of that. The Babylonian version, along the lines of Marduk's great struggle, is that it represents a constant effort to subdue and to dominate the chaotic forces of the universe. In Genesis, the goodness of creation is emphasized in every phase. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, whatever day. It's also true that the God of Genesis 1 is transcendent and supreme. The gods of Babylon are losers. I mean, they're okay. But here's the best part. This is the part that gets me teary-eyed when I think about it. The biggest difference between the two versions is what happens on the sixth day. Because it's in the Babylonian version, it's in the sixth phase that human beings are created to be the slaves of the gods so that the gods could rest. So the gods could take it easy and human beings are slapped with all the work. Okay. In the Genesis story, it speaks of on the sixth day. In fact, I'll go back to it, beginning at verse 26, where it said, "Then God said, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the wild animals of the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. The image of God, in Latin, the imago Dei. Scholars for centuries have debated, what does it mean for human beings to have been created in the image of God? What does that mean? Does it mean that we're like God in some fashion? We have perhaps the capacity for reason. We have a moral sense. Perhaps that's it. We have a sense of right and wrong, consciousness, any number of theories that as to what it means to be created in the image of God. And it really wasn't until scholars started to grapple with these ancient Babylonian roots that they ever really understood what the image of God meant. In Babylon, if you wanted to see the image of Marduk, if you wanted to see what Marduk looked like, okay, if you wanted to see the image of Marduk, you would go to the great temple of Marduk in Babylon, and you'd walk in, and at the front of the temple, big, giant, magnificent temple, there would literally be an image. There'd be a statue. There'd be a big, giant statue of Marduk. That is the image of Marduk, okay? Now, given that fact, think about what it means for Genesis to say that human beings were created in the image of God. If you want to see Marduk, you go see the image of Marduk. You look into the statue's face, and you perhaps, if you're of a Babylonian religious type, you get that warm, fuzzy feeling of majesty and might and power. Oh, Marduk, and you kind of get lost in it. Think about what Genesis is saying. Genesis is saying that if you want to see God, if you want to get a whiff of what God is like, look in each other's faces. Look in your neighbor's face. Look at these faces.
One of my favorite lines from Inherit the Wind is, God created man in his own image. Man, being a gentleman, returned the favor.
Right. Right. But, just really take that in for a second, that's what Genesis is saying, that human beings, in the Babylonian thing, human beings were created to be slaves of the gods. In the Genesis story, human beings are created to be the representatives of God, to be the ambassadors of God, to be the representation of God in the world, and hence all the language of human beings' relationship to nature, relationship to other living things. And it's obvious that we've really gotten that screwed up because what we do to the earth, we've really missed the mark. But the original intention, the teaching of Genesis 1, is that we're to be caretakers, that we are to exercise stewardship over the creation by being its caretakers, to be the representatives of God, to be the way that God takes care of the earth, is that God does it through us. We are the divine representatives. That's what Genesis 1 teaches. And so you see, when you take all of that together, all of it is a magnificent Jewish subversion of the Babylonian imperial story. That story that is used to prop up the legitimacy of Babylonian dominance and the dominance of the god of Babylon. All of that is intentionally and consciously subverted to assert that the God of Israel, the God who acts in the people's lives even now, is the Lord of all creation, the Lord of the universe, not just the God of Jerusalem or just the God of the Jews, but the God who created everything, the God who doesn't need to battle or struggle against anything. God speaks and it is done. And then God creates human beings not to be slaves. The Jews were not created to be slaves, even though the Babylonians told them that they were created to be slaves. Genesis 1 told them, no, you're not created to be slaves. You're created to be the face of God in this earth. You're not created to be slaves. And so one scholar once called Genesis 1 as the Magna Carta of human dignity. It was the first great expression. When we think that the concept of human rights was invented by philosophers during the Enlightenment, the Declaration of Independence and the assertion of the rights of all humankind, that's an Enlightenment invention. No, it goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. The assertion that we all, no matter how lowly we may be, no matter who we are, that we have dignity and worth because we are created in the image of God. Now, for me and my money, that makes for a vastly more valuable and more interesting and, frankly, more true reading of the first chapter of Genesis than what most of us are used to. Reading it as if it is meant to be a kind of pre-scientific, scientific treatise on how the universe came into being. And that, in fact, that wasn't the purpose of its writing in the first place. Its purpose was to provide an answer to a struggling Jewish community faced with the prospect of extinction against the pressure of a Babylonian imperial system that seemed to dominate everything, that threatened to swallow them up. Genesis 1 was a profound teaching that no, Babylon's supposed gods do not have the final word. That the God of Israel, the God who is alive in the history of Israel, is also the God of all the nations. And that's exactly what those people in exile needed. It kept them alive. It kept them alive long enough for them to hear the words of Isaiah chapter 40. Comfort, comfort, O my people, that the exile is about to end. All right, we are close to the end of our time. Let's talk a little bit. Let's spend just a few minutes talking a little bit about what we've done with the text today. Just any broad reflections, any general thoughts that you have?
I have a piece that I want to show everybody, and that is a fossil. I did Inherit the Wind here many years ago now, and I got to play Clarence Darrow.
Oh!
William Jennings Bryan is on the stand giving the 6,000-year-old theory.
Yeah.
Nero says, tells him when it was created, he said, is that Eastern time or Rocky Mountain time? And he goes on to say, how long is a day? You know, and
Yeah.
the final thing is, or could it be 10 million years?
Yeah.
And this is a fossil that one of the geology professors at West Georgia gave me, and he assures me that this fossil is at least 65 million years old.
Yeah.
And I use that as a prop.
Is it is that a trilobite or?
It's some kind of a bug, I think.
Okay.
Other than that, I don't know. You know.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's very interesting. It's a very interesting piece.
I want to show you these. These right here, I've had some of these. My dad will remember this. I've had these for almost all my life. These are called crinoids. Okay, crinoids date back to approximately 300 million years ago. It's just, I mean, it's just amazing that in holding, this was part of a sea creature. It was a more plant-like than anything else. It was almost like a kind of seaweed in a way. But this is about 300 million years old. I forgot that I mean, I knew I've long had these, but I forgot that I had them here in my church office. Trying to show another piece. Got a couple of shark teeth too that aren't nearly as old, but this is a brachiopod right here. This is of similar age. I don't think it's as old as the crinoids, but similarly a very, very ancient thing. I'm going to put these back. But for me, growing up, I will say that to my church's credit, my home church's credit, I was never taught by anyone that the world was only 6,000 years old. I was never given any reason to distrust science or what science taught us. And so for me, from the very beginning, life on Earth had always been here for hundreds of millions of years or more. And so it was always within that matrix that I also grappled with questions of God and, who God is and how God and creation are related.
To your point that we don't hear this anymore, I think it's because many ministers and a lot of church members do not think that the Old Testament is relevant anymore. And so we don't hear this because, there's one guy that I tried to teach a short survey of the Old Testament here, but he said, I think we just need to throw the Old Testament away. It's no longer relevant. And I think many ministers may feel that way. So we don't talk about it, despite all the universal truths and all this richness of everything that came before Jesus Christ that influenced that. But I think many people feel that it's not relevant. So it's not preached on and it's not talked about from the pulpit or among many members, sadly, I think.
No, I agree. I agree with you. I think you're absolutely right about your diagnosis of the issue. As anyone who's ever spent much time around me as a Bible teacher, that I think that view is so absolutely tragic. It's so, it is so absolutely wrong. It's just so fantastically wrong. And it's wrong for reasons that really shouldn't be that hard to grasp. For example, to Jesus, to the living, breathing Jesus who walked around what is today Israel in the early first century. What was Jesus's Bible? What Bible did he use? Could he turn to the Apostle Paul's epistle to the Romans? No, he didn't have it. He had the Old Testament. He didn't have it in a, in a nice, nifty, one volume form like this. But his scripture was the Torah. The Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that was the Torah. And the writings of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah. It's those writings that shaped Jesus's religious consciousness. I mean, it was those stories and those symbols, those categories that formed the theological machinery and theological worldview that Jesus had. You can't possibly begin to understand Jesus if you don't understand the scripture the only scripture that he knew. You just can't possibly begin to understand what Jesus was about without the Old Testament. Now, I know that y'all who have been with me for a long time know, that I deeply believe that. And it's why, we spent, before we spent a year on Matthew and probably will spend a year on Genesis, that we spent a good 4 or 5 months anyway on the so-called minor prophets. We started at, right after the major prophets. You've got Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Daniel's kind of a special category unto itself. But then right after, we started with Hosea, and we read every word of every verse from Hosea chapter 1, verse 1 to the end of chapter 4 of Malachi. And we saw again and again and again practically countless ways that the writings of those prophets that nobody's heard of, nobody knows anything about, the words and the ideas of those prophets show up in the New Testament, show up on the mouth, on the tongue of Jesus, and again, just reinforcing the point that we can't understand the New Testament. We don't have a chance of understanding the New Testament if we don't understand the Old, or if we're not actively trying to understand it. And the mistake is that so many people ignore the Old Testament, or their whole view is formed in what the church has taught about the New Testament, and then taken that and imposed it upon our reading of the Old. And that is exactly the opposite direction of what we should be doing. We should be doing the exact opposite of that. We have to understand the scripture, the only scripture that Jesus knew, to understand it properly, to understand it rightly. So that's why we study Genesis. Genesis is, it's the book of beginnings, the book of foundations. Everything, literally everything else that follows emerges out of these foundations. And so it's essential that we try to understand those foundations. All right. Okay, well.
Speaking
yes,
of foundations, may I say, I was just thinking about Indo-Europeans.
mhm.
I assume, so the Babylonians were Indo-Europeans. And what I'm getting at is the Babylonian myth wasn't the first one. There was something in the Indo-European structure. These people then went to India, and then if you read, and went all over the world, and if you read the Rig Veda or the Upanishads and their creation stories, you can see similarities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, there are a number of really interesting similarities. Now, I highlight the Babylonian because it's And we're going to see this for the next few weeks as we go
Mhm.
through the first 11 chapters. We're going to see just how profoundly steeped in the Mesopotamian
Mm,
world the first 11 chapters of Genesis are.
mm,
Just in terms of worldview, in terms of the cosmology that was assumed by
mhm.
all people.
Yeah.
It has that cosmology has its rootage in the ancient Tigris Euphrates
Yeah.
river basin, and so it is to that civilization that the Hebrew vision in Genesis
Mhm.
is the closest to. And later on, of course, when we get to Genesis chapter 12 and we are introduced to Abram, eventually to become Abraham, we see that it is that Abraham lives in Mesopotamia when God comes to him and says, I want you and your wife and everything that you own I want you to pack it all up and go to a land that I will show you, to
Mhm.
leave Mesopotamia. So, in a quite literal way, Israelite civilization ultimately literally comes out of that ancient Mesopotamian culture.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's good stuff. It's good stuff. Okay. Well, very good. Well, here we are at the end. Next week, we're going to look at uh, the second creation story, Genesis chapters 2 going into 3. And we're going to have, I say it's a second story, it's a second source. It's not the priestly source of today. It's going to be the J source, or the Yahwist source. The J source, uh, and why that matters, provides us a whole new avenue of interest and things to really get us thinking. But today, I leave you with the thought that the ultimate message of Genesis chapter 1 is that the universe has its foundation in a transcendent God who is Lord of the universe and Lord of the nations, and who created humankind in God's own image, not to be slaves, as the Babylonian imperial system dictated it, not to be slaves, but to be God's ambassadors, God's representatives in the world.
Tom,
Oh,
a very fine lesson. Thank you very much.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tom.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.